Welcome to the Kids with Big Emotions podcast. I am your host, Andi Clark. Today, we are diving into how your child is not too much. They're exactly enough. We have these kids where you may have this child where they're more curious. They might be more sensitive. They might be more intense. They might be more outside of the box. And the world often tells them that they're too much or they need to tone it down. Maybe even as a parent, you've caught yourself, I've caught myself thinking or saying, just worrying that if they're going to fit in, and sometimes saying, oh man, this kid's too much. Or maybe you have a kid that's fixated on topics that so deeply they talk about it nonstop, a certain topic. They can recall every single detail, every fact, every connection. And instead of being celebrated for their passion, they're told to talk about something else or stop being so intense or to act more normal. I know as well, like I'm in Facebook groups with twice exceptional kids where many of these are too much. They have so many big emotions. They may have anxiety. They may just act very different in public. And in those groups is the one safe space where these parents can actually post about their kids' achievements without people saying, maybe you should slow them down. So when a kid is grade skipping, or maybe in one subject that child is excelling. I know for us, we had a whiteboard in our dining room. And that whiteboard in our dining room, my kids, my one child especially, would break out into math equations, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He would, in the middle of dinner, be thinking of some math problem and have to write it down and go through all of it on this whiteboard. And I've actually pulled him out from school so that he could go further in maths because the school stayed at grade level. And I have been questioned by people about, is this going to be harder for them? There's so much where they're like, you're setting your kids up for struggles. You should slow them down so that they fit in with other kids. And what if I told you that this shutting down, this redirecting, this dismissing can actually create traumas in our kids? And it's not the usual way we think of traumas. So I have worked with first responders. I've dealt with big, deep, big T traumas, like these, what we think of traumas, right? These big events. But traumas aren't just major events. They can come from everyday experiences. A real trauma comes from actually being, quote unquote, too much for the world around them. Kids don't experience trauma they don't just experience traumas. Adults, we don't just experience traumas through major life events. But when we internalize reactions of others as proof of something that's wrong with ourselves, when something is too much, too soon, too fast, too long, it starts shaping our nervous system in ways that last into adulthood. I grew up thinking that I wasn't smart enough. I grew up thinking I wasn't good enough. I didn't realize at the time how much that shaped choices I made and how I stayed small for a lot of my life. It's taking me a lot of work on myself to get to where I am today, where I can have this podcast out here, where I can dive into these rabbit holes, deep holes of where I dive into and really understand that this too much of me, where I dive too much into subjects, is actually made me where I am so good at understanding all of the information. And I feel too much. I feel too much of what others feeling allows me to get into the shoes of the kids that I work with and the parents that I work with and understand them in such an empathetic, deep way because of my too muchness. But as a kid, my parents didn't understand my too muchness. And they also didn't understand all the subjects that I dove deep into. And so they would change the subject. And when they would change the subject, I would take that as proof that I wasn't smart, that I wasn't interesting, that I wasn't worth spending the time to listen to the stuff that I dove deep in. Because my love language as well is quality time through conversation. And when I can have deep conversations about kids with big emotions, about executive functioning, about stress systems, about traumas, oh my gosh, I feel so happy and so loved and so seen. And so those are the friends I surround myself with. It took me a long time to realize that my parents didn't know how to engage themselves in the things I was passionate about. And I absorbed their reaction and made it part of my identity as to how I believed that reaction was. And how many kids are doing that now? When We're getting notes from teachers saying they're too much in their own world, or they're too loud, or they're too fidgety. They don't sit still well enough. They're too creative at times. Like, what the heck? How many kids are experiencing this and being told these things in one way or another? Maybe not directly, it might be indirectly, that they need to actually dull themselves down. Hey, stop doing so much math. Stop diving into history, or whatever their subject of choice is. Can you at least do something else? Neurodiverse kids, they often pick up emotions of those that are around them. The trouble, though, is that we haven't been learned and we haven't taught these kids. I didn't learn this till an older age, that when we're feeling somebody else's emotions, they're not necessarily ours. That I had to learn that when I would go up to somebody and start feeling insecurity, or start feeling anger, or start feeling stress, that I had to realize, what was I feeling before I walked up to that person? Was I okay? Was I in any of those feelings? And if I wasn't, I'm like, oh, it's theirs. And I've had to learn tools and skills, which I do teach in my sports circle, how to block those and understand and learn that they're not mine. But I didn't know those as a kid. So I was picking up on all of the emotions of somebody around me and thinking that those were mine, which was part of my too muchness of feeling so much and feeling so deeply. So when a child is told that they're too much or too little, let's talk about how this can become a problem. So traumas, if we break it down into absolute simplicity, and this is through me working as a trauma-informed coach and working with all kinds of different traumas, from the stuff that kids hear that are actually innocent that can form traumas, to these deep-seated traumas that we do feel. If something is too much, too soon, too fast, or too long, they can become traumas. So too much would be an overstimulation, too many demands, too many sensory inputs. So my child going to school visually and auditorily took in so much. And the old schools, these schools just reverberate sounds like crazy in them. And he could hear every sound, every reverberation, every sigh of a kid, every foot moving. He could see everything, and he hadn't been learned to be able to dial it down when he needed and dial it up when it was his superpower and was needed for him to make change in this world. And that becomes a trauma, where he did not want to go to any gyms, any hockey rinks, any swimming pools, inside any schools that were just loud to him. All the places that reverberated sound became trauma responses for him. The anxiety going into them, the struggles going into them. Being too soon. If you're pushed to do something before you're emotionally or developmentally ready. And this is where it is this hard balance and this hard struggle when your kid is very academically ahead in things, is finding things that still works within their emotional and mental maturity and their abilities of actually showing the work and being able to do the work, but challenging them at the academic level that they're at. It's this fine balance, because yes, as I said earlier, some people are saying you could do damage to your child, and getting them into so many things, if that child is not ready for it, it could be too soon and create some traumas for them. That could even be going to school, where we may have a child that is academically ahead. We may have a child that's not. It's expected that at a certain age that child goes to school, but some kids still may not be ready because of the sensory overloads, because of all the things that are going to be going on there at school, that they may be able to handle certain aspects of it, but not all. And that becomes too soon. It could also be too fast. Big rapid transitions, not enough processing time, too many changes all at once. As much as it seems to us that we're like, okay, we go to school at this time every day. We need to go to school, and then you need to stop doing what you're doing and go to school, or even being at the playground. We see this all the time at the playground, where a child is struggling to transition from leaving a playground. That could be that the transition was way too fast for them in a way. It could also be that they're just having so much fun and they're not good with any change and transition, and we need to work the child from a different lens. So this isn't all of these things are not above board for the same kid. There could be 30 kids in a classroom, and some things are too fast, too much, too soon, or too long for one child. And it might be perfectly fine for many of the other kids in the class. All these kids are different. The kids that I work with often are affected way faster and to a larger degree from things that are too much, too soon, too fast, and too long. So too long could be prolonged stressors that are too long, could be extended discomfort, never getting relief. One thing I'm going to add to that too could be prolonged boredom. If a child is not being challenged at a level that they're at, it could be prolonged boredom as well that could be creating these traumas. And these directly apply to neurodiverse kids, to these kids whose brains think a little bit different or need a little bit more than other kids do at times. And it affects them in ways people don't realize because we don't feel it. So one thing as well, so an example is for me with sense. My one son and I are very, very, very affected by sense. I've told stories in previous podcasts as to how certain scents have affected us to the point where once we smell them, we get angry. My one son has kicked and hit like instantly, like you just see this change in us from synthetic fragrances. Like it is so fast. It does not affect my husband and my brother and my son, my other son. And it's been fascinating because they would see this, well, not see the scent. We would point out the scent and then they'd see our behavior change. That they saw it enough times that they started to understand it and see, wow, they really struggle with this. But it did not happen right away. And many people do not understand how sensitive we are to sense. And how could they? Because they're not in our shoes. They don't experience it. It is really hard for other people to understand that these kids are experiencing this. And so when a child is struggling with change, with transitions, with sensitivities, with emotions, a lot of people do not understand that because of the degree that these kids are feeling it or that we're feeling it versus the degree of what most people do feel that. And so the traumas hit harder and faster with us. So yeah, I have some examples too of how this also does work for kids. Too much could be the sensory overwhelm that we said, too many expectations at once, could be too many questions on a test at once, can totally overwhelm a kid. And if this is being done over and over and over again, I just did an interview, which I believe is airing before this episode, with Shauna, and she was speaking about how her son needed 2 questions at a time. And the school was like, okay, we'll decrease the questions he's shown at a time. He can do all of them. So if there's 20 questions, he can do all 20. He just needs to be shown less to not be overwhelmed and traumatized. When he sees 20, he goes into a freak out mode. So they brought it down to 10 and it wasn't enough. And the school went, but we brought it down. And that's the thing. We really have to understand where that dial is for that child. It could be everything happening in a room, conversations, background noises, flickering of fluorescent lights, getting overstimulated. But instead of recognizing it as being overwhelmed, they're labeled as too sensitive, too much, too sensitive. And that can become a trauma. Too soon is being forced into developmental leaps they aren't ready for. And this is one thing that is a huge struggle with kids that are ahead academically, is sometimes they are behind on social stuff. Sometimes we as parents can think that they're both the same when they're not, and it can become too soon for a child. So a child that struggles socially and is pushed into socializing without preparation, leading to rejection, anxiety, shutdowns. I know I was pushed ahead in school because a teacher saw my potential. The thing is that I actually had not struggled academically up until that point. So when that teacher did give me something that was challenging, I had no idea how to handle it. And I wasn't prepared to quote unquote fail. And that's where like fear of making mistakes, perfectionism, those traumas from those started coming in. And I started to take that as confirmation that I wasn't as smart anymore. I wasn't smart. Meanwhile, they were challenging me because I was ahead. And so sometimes we have to really stop and explain and help a child understand the situation that you aren't being challenged because you are ahead. So we need to give you things that are academically tougher and tougher for you so that we can find out where you are struggling, where you get stuck, so we can teach you the tools that you need to learn of how to work through that. These are things we don't normally say to kids because they are so ahead. We're like, oh, let's just keep giving this ahead until we find their ceiling, and not realizing that they're not equipped. So it's actually too soon because we didn't give them the skills. Too fast. Learning expectations, moving too quickly, expectations that don't allow for processing. Some of these kids that may be ahead in some things may process slower in other things, and they need more time to process. If a child is like fascinated by a topic and wants to spend hours on it, but the system moves them along, like so school, Say they're really diving into a subject and they love that subject and they want to dive and keep diving into it, but the school is like, nope, we have to move on to another subject. They might actually start losing interest in learning because they're not allowed to go at their own pace in the subjects they want to dive deep into. And that's one thing, like my son doesn't want to go to high school because he wants to keep going so deep into the subjects that he really loves, that he knows in school he's going to get only like one semester class on it, and he wants to dive deep into the chemistries and the biologies and the physics in such a deeper way than school will allow. So that's where like it can actually be a too fast thing where they're too quickly moving them away from a subject that they love. And that can actually trigger a child. That can change the way that you're thinking about yourself and your brain too. And it can decrease your love of learning, that spark that's in you. When something's too long, we can get that chronic stress, prolonged struggle without relief. This can be, even I'm thinking of things of like not getting enough sleep on a regular basis. So having that sleep deprivation over too long of a time, having a stress for that child. So maybe there is a sound always or a smell in their class all the time, day in, day out. They have that for too long. They can't handle it and it becomes part of a trauma. When a child is always masking at school to fit in, and then they come home and they have meltdowns because they've held it in all day, that's a part of too long. So when they say at school, oh no, they're a model student at school, but at home they're just like falling apart, that's where they were holding onto a stress for too long quite often. And now they're releasing that. And that over time can become a trauma in a child. And this is why kids start developing limiting beliefs. I don't like school. I can't be myself. I need to make myself smaller. This was totally me. My interests aren't important. I need to be perfect or I'll fail. There's so many different beliefs, and they don't just stay or like last in childhood. They become our default lens in how we move through life. We get all of these limiting beliefs in there. So how do we prevent this? How do we protect our kids from these like invisible traumas of being too much for the world? The first thing is by recognizing the subtle messages that they're internalizing. Pay attention to how people react to your child's behaviors. Are they being encouraged or redirected? Are they being told that they're too much in really small ways? So if your child is passionate about something and people brush it off, ask them how they feel about being brushed off about this or people's reactions. Some kids might be fine, and some kids might feel it deeply. Let them voice their emotions instead of really silently absorbing the ideas that their interests don't matter. This is so, so important. Help them understand that people may brush them off because the person doesn't understand, or kind of help them see as well when they're not interested in a subject that somebody else is diving into, how they struggle to keep a conversation with that person or keep going into it, and help them understand about preferred and non-preferred topics and how not everybody's preferred topics are the same thing. So we need to start helping that the way that they're perceiving that everybody should be interested in what they're interested in, and help them understand and find the people that are interested in what they're interested in, and that it's okay to have feelings of not being interested in somebody else's interest, but teach them how to handle it while feeling good about themselves and helping the other person understand that you're proud of them for what they're interested in, although it's not a huge interest point for you, so you can't talk about it in as depth or in the lengths that they want to talk about it. Another thing we can do for a child is create space where too much is celebrated. So if the world is telling them to dim their light, we have to be the ones as parents to say, your passion is amazing. Your energy is inspiring. Your deep dive into whatever subject that they're into is valuable, and start teaching them about all of the careers and paths they can go into if they continue to love that subject, or if they love to dive into another subject. You can keep doing that with every subject they're into. Start getting them surrounded by people that are into that subject. If they hyper focus on a topic, don't force them to move, lean into it with them. Show them that their excitement is valid. If you honestly do have to go and do something else, tell them how excited you are that they're into this, and point out different times that you're going to be able to come back and work on this. When today, when tomorrow, when this week can they come back and dive into all of the research that they're doing, or they're studying, or they're reading, or whatever it is that they're into? What is it? Like, really being supportive of their too much. I did talk about this as well in another episode about how a couple of weeks ago at a curling fun game, my son walked off of the ice because of others being that were on the ice were a little too competitive for him. It was too much for him and his sensitivities. And so we could have said, oh, he's being too sensitive. But I told him how proud I was for him respecting what he needed, and also respecting what the others on the ice were capable of giving and doing as well, and really honoring that, instead of saying, oh, he's being too much for stepping off of the ice. He was too much for walking away from the game. And that's where, when they're too sensitive, we need to really help these kids understand that honoring what they need in each moment in time, while still allowing the others to be involved in what they're being involved in, is perfectly fine, and being proud of them for that. Teaching kids to adjust without losing themselves. So how do we protect our kids from hindering trauma of being told they're too much, while also helping them navigate a world that really isn't always ready for them? So the thing is really teaching your kids, one of the skills that I love is teaching them about a dial. You have this knob, you have this dial. There's never a mute button on this dial where they fully turn it down. So you don't need to change, but is teaching them about reading a room, about when to adjust that dial. So you can talk about this a little bit with these people, so they get it enough and maybe start thinking about it and want to pique their interest. Or if you love to be creative and tell stories and all that, and you're in a very serious crowd, you can turn that dial down where you tell little stories or calmer stories, and then you dial it up when you're around people that are like loving it. So it's really about that dial. So there's moments where you do need to turn things down, like a library or a classroom. They need to dial that volume down a little bit. But when there are places they can turn it way up, when they can get on that dance floor and they can get on that stage and act or sing, or however they want to do, they can dress up and be as big as they want to be. They can be as nerdy or geeky as they want to be in all these other situations. Go for it. Teach them about when they are around surrounding themselves with their people, and that is awesome. And that the dial just comes down a little bit around people that aren't ever going to understand and appreciate them, because they have different brains, and that's okay. Another thing too is, when somebody else is uncomfortable, it's not their responsibility. So just because somebody else finds their emotions or their intensity overwhelming, it doesn't mean they need to change who they are. Now, I am putting a caveat on here that when they're like that, if it's major anxiety attacks and panic attacks and all of that, we need to help support that child. We need to help and support them, though we never ever shut that child down from believing that they shouldn't be concerned about things and they should never have these feelings. It's teaching them how to support and cope with those feelings. But I'm thinking of discomfort when like somebody loves acting and being out there, and other people like, oh, stop that, or saying, oh, you're being too geeky. They are totally fine. I love geeks. Geeks are like my people. And when someone's nerdy, like, I love that. I eat that up, but it's not for everybody. And they do not have to change who they are. They can be unapologetically themselves. Just because they're being too much for someone else, it just means that person isn't ready for what that kid brings to the table. And this is where we can teach them about maybe sometimes having a dial. But if that person is saying anything negative and trying to stunt them and change who they are, no, they can be unapologetically themselves. This is it. This is a huge part of it. Helping them find their people. It's not always easy. There might not be tons of people in the world that have interests of what your child's interested in, but you can find them, especially with the internet nowadays. You can find in Facebook groups, I've seen people going, my child is completely into like the universe, the atmosphere, to like such a deep level to this. Do you have another child that wants to maybe would hop on a Zoom call and chat with them about it? It's about finding your people. My kids have found their people through Pokemon, the card game, not the video game. They have friends that dive so deep into it, and their brains, they're just, it's awesome. We have one friend that is always over at her house. He is a Swiftie. He belts Taylor Swift at the top of his lungs. And it's gotten to the point where now when he's over, we have the Swiftie tour, the Eras tour playing on the TV all of the time. Usually somebody, when one of my kids is even singing now, and they just let him be unapologetically himself, and they accept him for him, which honestly has been amazing because it's helped my one son who feels he's socially awkward and doesn't fit in, which he's not. He's actually very socially able, but these are the things of feeling others' emotions and where you're at. He's actually started being more unapologetically himself because this friend is unapologetically himself. And it's just amazing. It really is amazing. So if a child is feeling too much in school, they may thrive in a robotics club, in an art studio, in a homeschooling co-op where their deep interests are welcomed. And instead of trying to make your child fit into every space, focus instead on helping them find spaces that fit them. And this is where sometimes we do have to mourn that our child is not going to be into the things that we'd hope they'd be in. If it's not into sports, if it's not into certain academics, if it's not into the arts, we may have to mourn that our child isn't going to be into those things, and really honor where our child wants to be and where they'll fit, and help them build resiliency about their identity. What we say to them now becomes the voice they carry into adulthood. If we teach them to embrace their strengths now, they won't have to unlearn the self-doubt later. You might be saying to yourself now, but what if my child really is too much for others? And this is the thing I did try to cover earlier, is that it's not about being reckless. It's about understanding who is worth adjusting for and who isn't. So having that dial for certain people, teaching them to be unapologetically themselves. And if it is a struggle where it is these big emotions, these outbursts, they're yelling, they're hitting, all of those things, it is helping working on giving them the tools for those things and finding the root cause. Because quite often the root cause with a lot of things with these kids is that something is too much, too soon, too fast happening in their lives and is causing a trauma response in them that is causing a lot of these big emotions. And we have to find out what it is. And it's going to be different for all of our kids. You might also be thinking, what if my child struggles socially? And quite often social struggles are an executive functioning skill, and we can work on helping them with perception to maybe perceive when it's their turn to speak, or perceive when somebody is upset or has different emotions around them, and that. So we can help them with that executive functioning piece. At the same time, their child might just be different, and there might be nothing. Is that the right words? There might not be, there's nothing wrong with that. If your child is different, you can find people that they can connect with as well that may have some of the same differences, or may totally mesh with those differences in your child's personality. Because honestly, not everybody wants to be around nerds, but not everybody wants to be around like the quote unquote popular kids either. We do need to find our people where we can socially fit in. And then once we're in these social circles, then we can work on some executive functioning struggles that may stop us from seeing others' emotions, knowing when it's our turn to talk, not touching everything around us, around other people, so that, or like not being in other people's personal space and stuff. Those are things we can help them with from an executive functioning lens. And then another thing you might be saying is, what if they don't know when to stop? And again, that's executive functioning. That's about perception, that's about inhibition, and it's about the self-awareness, which is different from self-rejection. We need to teach these kids about balance, not suppressing themselves. If they don't know when to stop acting and singing and just being goofy everywhere, that is where we do need to teach them about the dial, maybe in school during class while the teacher's teaching, but on recess, they can full on let it all out. So it's about teaching them about that dial, teaching them from an executive functioning lens so they can perceive when to be like that. Not saying that it's wrong, just saying that, helping them understand how that can disrupt a teacher from teaching. without taking away your child's personality and who they are and that superpower that is going to help them change the world. And I am going to say this again, because I did just say this. Self-awareness is different from self-rejection. We need to teach the balance, that dial, not suppression. All right, that was a lot. I want to kind of let's recap on what we did just talk about. So trauma isn't just about big events. It's about how kids interpret what's happening to them. Being told something is too much, too soon, too fast, too long. It really can create these lasting beliefs that can stifle who they are as a person, these limiting beliefs that they carry into themselves as adults. And you can definitely help them. I've given some tools and skills that you can start working on. If you do want help supporting your child navigate this, you don't have to figure this out alone. That's what I do in my support circle. We have a private membership where you can get tools and strategies. There's a community there with other parents with kids like yours, and we can help your child thrive without feeling that they need to change who they are. So the link for the support circle is in the show notes. If you're not sure you're a right fit or you have questions for me, you can book a 30-minute call. That link is also in the show notes. You can book a call with me, ask me all of your questions, and we can figure out the best next steps. I do work one-on-one with clients as well. And though many of my one-on-one clients too, some of them are already in my support circle as well for the additional community support. So I look forward to seeing you in the support circle, hearing from you. Ask me any of your questions. I am here to support you anytime, and I will see you in the next episode.